A stereotypical image of a lawyer is a boring individual dressed in black and white with a bunch of books. However, today many lawyers rarely see the inside of the courtroom. These transactional lawyers help business owners and other clients with the legal aspects of complex transactions. Today on An Hour with LawSikho, we will discuss the most sought after type of the lot, the transactional corporate lawyer. Joining us today on the webisode is Swetha Gopalakrishnan, a law graduate from India and a current JD candidate in the United States looking to gain work experience and practice international law issues relating to corporate transactional and intellectual property law. Welcome everybody. You're watching An Hour with LawSikho and I am Aditya. Shweta, we are absolutely delighted to have you today with us on this show.
Hi, thank you so much for considering me to be part of the show. It's really exciting to talk about what I'm doing right now and hope to be doing in the future years. And hello to everyone who's watching this live right now and also who's going to be watching this later. So, hi.
Thank you, Shweta. All right, so let's start with this, and let's start with why don't you tell us a little about yourself and tell us about what you've been doing and what you plan to do in the near future.
Sure. Just as you introduced, I am a law graduate from India. I did my bachelor's of 5 years in ILS in Pune, and then I also have a postgraduate diploma from NLS Bangalore in intellectual property laws. And and then around my third or fourth year, I was deciding between an LLM and just going abroad and gaining a lot of work experience because I wanted to work with startups and just tech companies in their transactions. So I got to know about the JD and the fact that we could apply to being non-US citizens. So I gave it a shot and I got accepted into UC Hastings, which is one of the top schools for intellectual property and corporate transactions, especially because it's located so close to the Silicon Valley. So it's just the perfect place to be. And right now, I just completed my second year. I had my finals last week, and next week I would be starting to work in-house in the legal compliance team of an investment firm down in the city. So that would be a great experience, and hopefully in the coming years, and I would just be expanding on my practice of doing transactions with corporations or working at corporations and helping them with the transactions. So yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Shweta, for giving us a brief. But when you say transactional corporate law, what do you exactly mean by that? What do you exactly mean? Like, because in India, what we know is corporate law in general, and everything
Right.
relating to it is corporate law.
Right.
Where is the line that you draw between a corporate law in general and transactional corporate law?
Right. So there are two aspects to the legal field everywhere. So one is the transactional lawyer, and most often it's related to corporate transactions, and there is litigation. But when we say general corporate law, it not only means helping corporations incorporate, working with their startups, but it also means that if they run into litigation, sometimes which happens during mergers or something goes wrong, then you also help them do it. So that's another ball game entirely. You work with litigation part of them. You actually represent the companies in court. But working transactionally is pretty much uh, kind of like working behind the scenes. So you try to prevent problems before they happen. So you actually work with companies when they're negotiating, during the process when they're actually making up the agreement. So it's a lot of drafting, and it's a lot of it's a writing based sort of a practice. I mean, though litigation is also writing, you write briefs and you write pleadings to the court, but this is you write it for the client. So you basically are working to prevent the client from any litigation. So yeah, that's pretty much the basic difference.
Thank you, Shweta. Shweta, why don't you tell us a little about your experience of getting into transactional corporate law route, and how
Sure.
did you go about it?
Yeah. I actually wanted to. I knew I wanted to do corporate law ever since I joined law school. That's because my family has just a lot of background in business. My dad comes from a science background. He's an engineer. So I've just heard a lot of business dealings and him talking to the company lawyers when he was working with. So it was just a lot of background and just growing up in that atmosphere. But once I came to law school, when I joined, I had this really star-eyed feeling. Oh, corporate law! It just means that you wear all those fancy suits, and it's probably like Boston legal, and you're just working high-end transactions. But once I joined ILS, that's when I realized, after talking to my seniors, talking to a number of attorneys in the field, that it's an entirely different ballgame. That there are two very different things. To get into those high-end transactions, it comes later, but earlier is you start figuring out which aspect of corporate law you want to do. If you want to do compliance, which is again a different uh, ball game in corporate transactions. So you just deal with compliance, regulatory compliance, filings. So that's a lot of manual groundwork that a person does. Then there's the legal transactions, which lawyers actually help companies negotiate and start, like I said, working with their mergers or incorporation and actually framing the contracts. So how I got into it, I would. It actually started with my very first legal internship in India. I worked with this really small boutique law firm at that time called Vichar Partners, but now it's part of JSA Chennai. So they were hired. I think they merged a couple of years ago. So that actually gave me the groundwork because it was a perfect setting for a second year law student at that time to just know what corporate law in general meant, because there were three partners. One entirely took over litigation. He did arbitration and he did commercial litigation. One of the partners, she did entirely transactional work, and she had an LLM from the US. So she was the one I worked under because I specified in my statement that I wanted to learn transactional lawyers or just work with companies. And the third partner, she was a mediator, and now she's an international mediator, meaning she works with a lot of companies. So it just started with that internship and under Ms. Arti Sivanan, who took me under her tutelage, and she explained to me the different aspects of working with clients, sitting in client meetings. She gave me the opportunity to actually sit in with client meetings. The associates that I worked with, they gave me a couple of tiny projects, and then they started giving me big projects. They started involving me in a number of different transactions that they were doing at the time. So it was just seeing all the different transactions. It was not just one, it was not all big companies. Sometimes it was government agencies working with companies. So it was, okay, two different aspects of it. A government has different interests as opposed to a private corporation. A nonprofit has a different interest as opposed to some company like Apple, which has profit sharing objectives. So it was just learning about the different aspects and different types of everything. So that was my first intro into transactional. And then I would say all my other internships just sort of started building into that. My second internship was uh, purely corporate. It was both compliance and it was just legal issues and framing. So at the time, and the time that I interned was when the Companies Act in India changed, the 2012-13 period. So it was an entire new act, and people were struggling to figure out what it actually meant. So yeah, that was another aspect of compliance corporate law that I got to learn. And then my final internship before I moved here was again was with JSA Delhi. So it was in the litigation office, but I got the opportunity to do both litigation and corporate transactions. So it was a lot of just intellectual property licensing, and a couple of them were corporate or I would want to frame it better, maybe business transactions or just agreements between the government agencies like the Food Authority of India, the Airports Authority of India, and with companies, because uh, companies sometimes fund these airports for their maintenance and everything. So it's just a lot of reviewing of those contracts and making of new contracts and agreements and non-disclosure agreements and all those fancy terms that we actually hear in law in these legal shows. But yeah, it was so that is how gradually I got pulled into this niche sort of a practice.
All right. Shweta, tell us something. How different it is to get an internship in India, and how different is an internship abroad from an Indian internship?
Um, so in a way, they're pretty similar. So in India, when I started out applying, it's pretty much the same application process. Some companies have their contact us page where you find the link. Otherwise, sometimes it's mostly through contacts. You know someone who knows someone who's working there, or you know someone who's the person who's working there, and they help you get into the system. But yeah, surprisingly, almost all my India interviews and internships happened after I started applying to a bunch of places, and and then I thankfully got a call, and then it went through the system. So one of the prerequisites that they need is good grades. So in India, like in the US, is good grades. Make sure you have a good academic standing for the US equivalent. And so once that happens, it's just a pretty straightforward application process. Here in the United States, for example, so there are two different aspects to internships. One is the on campus interviews, which in India is usually around the last few years of your law school, but here it happens in the second year, which is like a year before you graduate because it's 3 years. So that happens with all these big law firms, um, and that is entirely so that's a separate application process. So you go through the school's website and try to do that. Or the other route, which is the one I took because I wanted to work in house, is just seeing how applications start coming out in LinkedIn. Make sure you have enough people, contact people. It's kind of I wouldn't say difficult, but it's kind of a new ball game when you're in another country without any contacts and you're trying to get a legal internship. So my first year and pretty much um, whatever time I could get my second year, I tried to meet as many people in the legal field in and around San Francisco, because this is where I realized I wanted to be working. So I met a lot of people, just understood how they did their law school journey, and pretty much like how I'm doing the life, I actually went and met them. So just like learning their experience and talking to them. And that was one of, uh, that was an ongoing process. I'm still doing that here, just so I have contacts once I graduate as well. And then it was just applying through LinkedIn, through Glassdoor, and just all these online job portals. And our school also has a job portal. So I started applying, and most in-house people don't really decide that they need someone until the very last few months of your school. So and then I got this then this application opened up, and it was something that I've already done before in India with compliance and with legal research, and it's just sort of felt like the right fit, and I applied for it. And luckily here I am. I got the job offer. So yeah, so it's kind of a different ball game. It's in India, it's mostly just through school or sometimes through your contacts. Here it's through contacts. Sometimes it's cold calling. You just um, see a law firm or a company that you think, oh, this is really great. I really want to learn how to work with them, and then you just like send out a message through their contact us box, which is kind of weird. And it's like, oh, so this is what I've done. I'm hoping you guys have a legal intern position. And when you do, think of me, and here's my resume. So I've done those sorts of things as well. But it's just a different, and it's also knowing people, and it's also just making sure you place yourself on the map. People know you're there, and again, I'll also have good grades, make sure you are doing everything and taking the right classes in law school, just gearing towards your practice area that you want to go into. So yeah.
All right. Uh, Tell us something. Most people go to US to study and to get a job, mostly to get into the litigation sector, or probably to get into a good law firm. However,
Right.
you choose something absolutely different, and you want to get into an in-house of a certain company. What led to that decision? What made you think that okay, not the conventional law firm would be the right
Yeah.
choice for me, but an in-house work, which is in India at least it's thought that it's not as taxing as a law firm job is. Is that the same case there in US? And if
Mhm.
that is, then what led to that choice?
Sure. So in-house, I know a lot of people do think that it's oh, in-house means it's an actual 9 to 5 job. You get to go home after 5 p.m. And as opposed to a law firm, you actually have to work like 20, 30 hours sometimes in a day, or you just like have continuing working days and you don't really know which is day, which is night. But uh, from whatever I have, so to answer your first question, first part, which is how did I think of going in-house? So I actually always wanted to go in-house, but it was just whether going after a few years of practice in a law firm or it was just starting out directly. But like I said, most of my practices and internships in India was with a law firm, but I worked with a company, and I know every company has a legal team because, like the ones that my father's worked in, or even the ones that I've interacted with through my law firm, they had their own legal team, but they came to outside counsel, which is law firm, for specialized issues. So I was really interested at that time knowing what these in-house counsel jobs look like. Like, what did they do that sometimes companies actually needed outside counsel? So it just kind of intrigued me. And once I moved to the US, and especially in the Silicon Valley, you have tons of startups, you have tons of tech companies because the hotbed of technology. And so when I was doing my networking, I met a lot of general counsels from various startups here. For example, Uber is right across the block from where I live. Twitter's headquarters is also a block over. So I just, and there are a lot of networking opportunities when you're living in the city and it's in downtown and it's actually in a place where you have financial and technological transactions. So once I started learning about what they did, it just solidified my interest of going into and learning what an actual in-house counsel job looks like. So I took the offbeat route my second year. I waited and did not really consider a big law firm job, and I waited to go in-house because I just wanted to know how different or is it the same that I've heard about. And from my experience of talking to the people, it's not really a 9 to 5 job. The main differences between in-house and law firms, for example, is in-house, you don't really specialize in something. You pretty much hands-on try to work on every aspect of what the company needs. For example, it's employment, it's corporate transactions, it's intellectual property licensing, it's sometimes mergers and acquisitions, or it's credit transactions, so or financial taxation. So you basically it's like a jack of all trades, but people have specialized niches in that too. There are many lawyers in house, and they all have different practices that they specifically take over. But overall, an in-house lawyer starts and they work for everything that the company needs. And again, though it might seem like it's 9 to 5, sometimes um, company it doesn't. It's not really a 9 to 5 job. For example, the one that I'm going to be working in this summer, it has offices all over in all over the world, and it has offices in India, it has offices in Singapore and London. So most of the time, the lawyers, when they were telling me, it's they work on different time schedules. For example, in India, in the US, you have three different time zones. So some people actually work in the New York time zone, so it's easier for them to contact their London office or their subsidiaries in India or their subsidiaries in Singapore. So it's not really a standard 9 to 5. Just it depends on how much the company needs. But sometimes, yes, there are days when people get to go home from at 5 p.m. and then they have the rest of their life. Most often, I feel it's the weekends, but in a law firm, sometimes you give up on weekends. But it depends and comes and goes as the need of the company, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's not typically like a government job in India when people say, "Oh, it's just a 9 to 5 job." It's not really like that. It depends on which company you're working. For example, if you're working with a startup which is just starting out, you pretty much work the same long hours you would work in a law firm because you're actually incorporating the company. You're making sure every single thing that it needs to start working and being out there as a separate corporate entity is perfect. And you're trying to make all the compliances work, the regulatory compliances, SEC filings or ROC filings, for example, in India. So it's just it depends on the type of company you're at.
All right, that was beautiful answer. So I was reading this article the other day, and it had the McCrate report that was
Mhm.
published by American Bar Association, and it said that most attorneys fail to appreciate how important it is to decide which career option to choose or which niche to choose for people who want to get into a specific genre of practice.
Right.
And I think the same holds true for transactional corporate law as well. So I have a
Mhm.
question from Sarang Khanna, which was also my question, that what are the areas to focus during the college for someone looking for a corporate transaction job, and how to spread your internships to achieve that goal?
Okay. That's actually a good question. Thank you. So I can I'll talk about it in two different answers for people who've actually done that in the U.S. So in the U.S., you it depends. Law is kind of like a graduate degree, but you do it after your bachelor's. So you just get 3 years as opposed to India, where you do right after high school, unless you're doing the LLB option, which is the 3 years equivalent after bachelor's. So I would just say, and in India, it depends. I came from a non NLS background. So from uh, what I had from ILS was pretty much fixed schedules of classes that you could take and you had to take. For example, we had to take English and legal English, and we had to take economics and then contract law and all those. And I think we just had two um, semesters in which we could choose. So I pretty much played by my interests at that time, and I chose the classes that were offered and that felt pretty exciting to me compared to the other choices. But depending on how different it is for NLUs in India, I cannot talk about that. So make sure you know your curriculum better. You know which classes, if you can choose your classes. For example, in the US, in the JD program, the first year is pretty much spelled out for you because you're being introduced to the to law school. But the second, third year, you can choose your classes. So I've taken classes in the past year that I know I want to work in. For example, I took business associations. It was an introduction to how companies are incorporated in the US and how they face transactional problems and also litigation problems later. This semester, I did mergers and acquisitions, which is an extended version of business transactions entirely from the point of view of just doing mergers and asset and stock acquisitions between companies, which is something that happens more often than we realize. And I took copyright law, which is an introduction to how copyright works in the US, the litigation aspects, the filing aspects, and all those different areas. So it just depends on your law school if you can take as many, if you have choice in taking classes. But if not, for example, in India, I just started doing a lot of reading and research on my own. Um, for example, in ILS had this even though it just had 4 5 hours of classes every day, it gave me an outlet because I could do other things. So I started reading on my own. I started reading books in the library on different topics in copyright law, in trademarks, in employment law. But with corporate employment, there is corporate taxation. Companies have different tax rules in India and in the US that they have to comply with. So it all depends. If you're looking to go into this, try to gain as much knowledge, meet as many lawyers as you can. So that's one of the other advice that I would give. And just apart from that, um, and spreading, going to the second part of the question, for practical experience. So in India, since with the 5-year law program, people don't really know what they want to do when they come right out of high school, and and it's it's true. I mean, you wouldn't know what you want to do when you're 17 or maybe even 18. So I would just say do a lot of internships on different areas. So my first year, we had the, and it depends in different cities. So try a nonprofit, try just working with a lawyer. I worked with one of my extended family members. He was a civil litigator. He still is a civil litigator in Chennai. That was my first summer. I just wanted to know how like court systems work. Like, what do litigation people do? Like, do they always go to court and argue? But no, it's like you do spend a lot of time drafting your pleadings, and you actually spend time just doing the outside legwork. And only when you get your chance and day in court do you actually go to court. So just gain a lot of experience doing and different aspects. So there are opportunities in India as well to work in-house, summer internships, or even winter internships, depending on the trimester or the semester system of your school. So just try putting yourself out in and putting yourself on the map. So just start applying to different places. When I was in law school in India, super lawyers were something that I frequently read about because it exposed you to so many different peers and colleagues of yours who are actually doing the work that you want to do. There's Loctopus, which gives you a guide of all the internships, and people actually talk about their internship experience in different companies. So you know, okay, is this place a nice place to work at? They treat interns really nice. Do the interns actually feel happy working there? So just try to gain knowledge from all those, and internet is really amazing. And then there's iFeeders, and you have all these online courses that you can take. I did a couple of online courses on the World Intellectual Property Organization. So they give free courses on just general IP law. They have free courses, and there's iFeeders, and there's something called Coursera in the US. And I think it's also available in India, which gives you free courses on just how to expand your knowledge base. And you can get all these legal certifications, or you can do a postgraduate diploma, or you can do the master's program, or just the distance learning from all these NLUs. So that's also another way to find out about the different practice areas. And just for practical knowledge, I would just say sometimes talk to your professors. They might have insights into it. Just start applying for jobs in different areas, nonprofits, private companies, startups. There are a lot of startups in India right now. So that might be a good opportunity to just see if you work well in a startup atmosphere, or you actually work well in a big company. And then you can decide between a small law firm, between litigation, between corporate transactions, or even just pure corporate litigation. So yeah.
All right. We have a question right now from Mohana Thakur. You had said that a transactional lawyer in in an in-house firm basically needs to know a bit of everything, and he needs to do
Mm-hmm.
everything in general, as
Right.
opposed to a transactional lawyer working in a law firm who's working on a
Mm-hmm.
specific domain knowledge.
Right.
Mona's question is that would you say that an in-house lawyer requires specific domain and industry knowledge as well?
Yes, I mean, that's absolutely true. It depends again on the type of company that you're working with. For example, if you're working with small startups, or if you're working with an investment firm, for example, like or so there are different types of companies, and almost everyone needs in-house lawyers. So if you're working with Wikipedia, for example, the Wikimedia Foundation, so they require a lot of background knowledge on Creative Commons licensing, copyright licensing, because they do a lot of that. I mean, you have information on Wikipedia, and that's part of their copyright. They have other aspects like the dictionary and all those things. So they have different aspects of licensing that you would probably need a background in, even if you don't need complete knowledge in it. Or if you're working with an investment firm, you basically might need to know how investments or credit transactions happen, some idea, or even just a basic knowledge that there is something called the Bombay Stock Exchange, there's something called the New York Stock Exchange, there are public companies which are listed on it. So just those tiny aspects, even if you don't have, if you don't come from that background, it's fine. I didn't come from an investment law background, and but these are things that you start learning once you start working over there and at the place that you want to be. So having just a basic idea, and that can happen if you just read about the company online. Every company has a website. Just read about their background, the transactions that they do. So you would have a basic idea of what they do. For example, startup techs here, or technology startups, to frame it better, they do a lot of, they're basically just a bunch of engineers. So that doesn't mean you need to know everything, like whatever engineering product that they're coming up with. You just need to know the legal aspects of it. So in United States, once I moved here, there are two different aspects to intellectual property. They call it's not that prevalent in India yet, or it's coming to the forefront. But there is patent prosecution, which is all these scientific lawyers, and it's mostly just engineers in the US. At least it's engineers who then, after their bachelor's in engineering, come to law school, and then they do just patent licensing. So it's reading all the patents. It But there are people who do patent litigation even without a science degree or a science background. That doesn't mean they need to know, oh, this is an AC DC conductor, or it's a generator. They don't need to know the specifics of, or the physicality of how the product is working. They just need to know if the patent is being framed correctly. They need to know how to read the law. So yes and no, to answer Mona's question. You would need a sort of background in the industry you're working, but most of the time it comes after you're working in the industry for a long time. For example, the music industry or just entertainment. You need to know there's something different about it as opposed to every other aspect of law. But the workings of it and the main background, people start knowing once they go into the field. And yeah, you don't really need to know exactly and everything about the field that you're working, but just a working legal knowledge of the legal aspects of it.
All right. Shweta, a specific way of becoming a litigant in America is to go for your JD, to get a clerkship, and register yourself with American Bar Association,
Right.
if I'm not wrong.
Mhm.
What is the way to become a transactional lawyer? Is there a specific procedure to do that as well?
So there are different types, different ways in which people can become transactional lawyers. In So you can either get an LLM and just have your basic law degree transferred and converted to the US standards, and then just write a couple of qualifying exams, get a job with a law firm, get a job with an in-house or a big company, or just with a startup, and start working and helping in them transactions. That's one way. The other way that I'm doing is through the JD program. I got enrolled through the JD, and then you figure out over your summer internships, and then you get offered a job, and or you start looking for a job in that area. But however, you do have to register for the bar with the state bar of whichever state you're practicing. That's a mandatory requirement, uh, regardless of whether you're a litigator or you're a transactional attorney in the US. So that is something that remains the same. Uh, if you're doing even if you're doing transactional work and you're working with business transactions, sometimes people do the clerkship through school as an externship just to know how the court system works. So it's just gaining another aspect of it. Just because you work with companies and you're not really going into and before a court doesn't mean you're oblivious to the entire workings of a court. So people do a clerkship. So I wouldn't say it's just for litigators. Sometimes transactional attorneys do it as well. But it just depends. If you already have a working knowledge of how the court system works, most people in the US actually who do the JD program sometimes know it from their undergrad experience, or if you're coming from another country, for example, like India, it's kind of similar because we're all common law countries, so it's pretty much the same. But if you're coming from a civil law country, for example, the European countries, those students who do an LLM or a JD in the US, they kind of prefer doing clerkship because then they understand how the US court system works. So it's easier for them to assimilate themselves to the climate and the atmosphere of legal working in the US.
All right. You talked about the fact that you can get your degree converted
Mhm.
uh, as per the US standards. Why didn't you go for that instead, and along with an LLM? Because you already said that the transactional corporate system requires a certain amount of specialization. So why didn't you go for a specialized LLM along with getting your degree converted, and why did you opt for going for a JD instead?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I went to the JD program, especially because once I knew it was 3 years, and so um, let me answer it the other way. So if so, although there is an option of converting my law degree and doing the LLM, after the LLM is mostly just for like 10 months to a year. So any work experience that you would get is right after you graduate your LLM. You wouldn't really have working knowledge of companies unless people I didn't do that, but many people actually work a couple of years in the home country and then come do the LLM. So they have a lot of working knowledge. I just had internship knowledge from working through my years in law school. So I didn't have a full time job before I chose to do my studies. So that's actually a personal choice. For me, I realized that, oh, just a second. I realized that because I wanted to work in transactions, I realized if I do the JD route, I would have at least two options of doing a summer internship in the US, and that would just give me a lot of exposure. Like I said, just working with companies and a lot of opportunity again to network with attorneys and people. So that was one of the prime reasons why I went to the JD route and I didn't really do the LLM, because then it would that was especially considering that I did not have a lot of permanent work experience in India. But it can depend, and it's different for people who do have work experience in India before. If they choose after 3 years of working full-time jobs, if they want to do an LLM, instead of investing 3 years in their education, it's easier if they just get it converted and then they do a 10-month LLM and then they get placed at a job. But since I didn't have that, that was and I also education is an investment. So as much as you can learn about U.S. law, it's easier, it's nicer, and you have a better understanding of the system that you're trying to assimilate yourself to. So yeah, so that was one of my primary reasons to do the JD.
All right. Shweta, I have a question right now from Sarang Khanna, who wants to know, apart from the conventional options like the USA or the EU, which are the other countries that are a good option to establish your career in corporate transactions?
So considering, just give me a second. So considering we come from a common law country, it's easier, I would say, to work not just in the U.S. or or European countries. um, not really all of the Europe countries, maybe the United Kingdom, because that also has a common law system. So I would say any country that has a common law system or was part of the Commonwealth before and they still follow common law in their country is easier to assimilate yourself and to learn about their law, as opposed to civil law, which is entirely different and they base their laws a lot on the statutes. So common law, for those of you who are unsure about common law and civil law, so it's common law is mostly a lot of deference is given to Supreme Court precedents, and the country's courts actually interpret, and we have the cases which we follow as case law, and which is part of our legal rules. And as opposed to the civil law countries, they're mostly entirely just based on the statutes made by the legislators. So I would say, from whatever experience that I've gained so far, it's easier to assimilate yourself to a common law country, because it's you would find a lot of similarities in their workings, even though they might be dissimilar in some aspects of the rules. But it's easier to learn and work at a common law country. So you have Canada, you have the other countries. So if you're looking to gain a lot of experience, you have other countries as well, and it also depends on the law firm presence. Now, law firms, just like companies, they're global. They have offices almost everywhere. They have offices in and um, they have like offices in Canada. They have offices all over the United States and London and just Hong Kong, Singapore. So it's um, it's just come together to be one system if you're thinking of international transactions, because companies, and with the boom of the internet and everything, it's just come a lot closer. So yeah, just try to do a lot of research on that and figure out which countries have similar laws to the ones that you've read. It would be easier as a process to get your um, work experience there, or even get an LLM, or just convert your legal degree. So that depends, and that would be country specific. So yeah.
All right. I have a question right now, and this is a question again from Mohona. But I'll be clubbing this question with another question. The question is that would you say that the law students in India move towards a career of corporate transaction as it's a high paying job? In addition to this, you also want to know that people generally decipher legal jobs abroad, especially litigation, to be a very high paying job.
Right.
So, what is the difference between the pay package of a litigation personnel versus a transactional lawyer?
Again, thank you for the question. So that actually, again, it depends on the. Uh, so I know in general there is this feeling that, oh, especially in India, maybe, that litigation you don't really earn a lot, as opposed to transactions or just working in um, in with companies, you have a steady pay package. But that actually more or less is, it depends on the law firm. For example, in India, if you start working under directly under a lawyer for a court, or you start representing, or you just sort of become an advocate enrolled in court, and you don't go through the traditional law firm route, then yes, the pay scale varies depending on your senior and who's ever paying you. But if you go to a law firm in India for litigation jobs as well, you have pretty high paying packages, and that's pretty much equivalent to what you would get in transactional legal firm and a law firm job as well. So uh, so in I know it's people have this notion that if you do litigation, then you would have to wait a couple of years before you start seeing the money. But that's not really true. If you go through the law firm route and you start being in a litigations law firm, you do get a steady pay package. And and moving to the difference between India and the US, it just it's different, primarily because they're two different countries and they have two different pay packages and scales. And a law degree in India is comparatively, I would say, is less expensive than people who go through the JD route in the US. Having done both of them, I can safely say that people sometimes do spend a lot of money in the 3-year JD program because it's a lot more intensive. It's a lot more, and it's and basically it's styled Doctor of Law in the US. So it kind of has a lot of deference. Most people in the US don't really do an LLM after because, like I mentioned before, they after the first year you get to choose your classes. So sometimes people actually specialize in the JD program itself because they realize I am spending a lot of money in it and I'm investing a lot of time and energy into getting a law degree. So instead of continuing with an LLM, they pretty much just um, specialize while doing the JD, which is kind of what I'm hoping to do with just business transactions and IP, and that's my focus in my JD program. So, and again, in the US, it depends between big law firms, mid-sized law firms, small law firms, working in-house with big companies and also with startups. So everyone, depending on how much ever they have their ranges of pay, it's different. For example, big law firms, yes, you do get a healthy pay package. It's more than anyone would ever imagine a law student would get after a placement. But it also, I think, relates to the amount of debt that most law students end up in after doing the JD program in the US. And it's also because they're big law firms, so they take in a lot of students and they invest a lot in the training, and that's why they're big law firms and they're more eye-catching to students once they come into law school. Then you have all these mid-sized and small law firms, which, depending on the pay scale, it's kind of lesser than the big law firm, but it's pretty sufficient. And then you have the in-house and the other side of the legal fields, where again, if you're in a big company, like if you're working with Google, if you're working with Apple, and all these brand named companies, Intel, Applied Materials, so there are big companies that have been here for a long time, then yes, your pay package with them working in-house is going to be pretty decent, as opposed to a startup which is just starting out, which has just incorporated. You might again not see a lot of pay. You might not see regular pay. It might be on and off depending on how the company is running its profits, losses. So it depends again on the company structure. When you're working with a startup, if you're the only lawyer that they have, you're pretty much the one who's making the company's charter and articles, deciding the pay scale for everyone. So again, yeah, so it depends on which aspect and which route you take through your law practice, and it and it and it's not true that litigators earn less than transactional lawyers. It just depends on which route you take um, to go into the law practice.
All right. Tell us something. You are in USA. You are somebody who comes from a different country. How difficult it is, or how beneficial it is, to be a person of diversity in a country
Right.
like US to get a job, a good job as a transactional lawyer.
Um, That's actually a really great question. And especially in the recent times, in school, we have a lot of diversity inclusion. So in the US, they place a lot of importance for diversity. And all these big law firms actually have, my first year when I was networking, they had a lot of diversity networking options. There is specific ones just for South Asian lawyers, for people who come from South Asia, like me. And so it so it's and per law, they have to, under in US, they're supposed to, by law, not discriminate anyone based on race and national origin. So they have a lot of diversity inclusive programs, because in the past years, I believe they didn't have a lot of people of color working all legal departments are just working in general in a lot of different places. So they have a lot of awareness programs. And for me, I would say it was I sort of maybe had an advantage having gone to law school in India, as opposed to someone who would just do their bachelor's and then do the LSAT and come here. Or so I already had an idea of how the legal system works. So in that way, I knew it was about networking and just meeting people. So in a way, I was on the same footing as all my classmates were when I started law school, and just meeting new people. There are many people whom I know. Most of my friends here do not come from a law background, and they don't have lawyers in their families. So it was just new for them as well to reach out to people, to find people who are doing the practice area work. So it's just a lot of cold calling. Make sure you have a good LinkedIn profile, I would say, because in uh, right now, especially in the US, people do check your LinkedIn profile even for a job interview. They actually go through your profile and see if you've listed the same things you have on a resume. So, and it's also one of the great places to meet a lot of lawyers who are alumni, who work in the same practice area. So I got involved in a couple of diversity um, organizations. I was part of the South Asian chapter in school. I still am a part of the South Asian chapter in school. I was and still am a part of the South Asian Bar Association as student member. So it's just that it opens up your uh, opportunities to meet a lot of same people who've actually gone through the same path. So they can tell you about from their experiences of having done this. So yes, it is different and in a way, I would say challenging to be from a different country without having any roots in another country and trying to, find a place for yourself and find a job or just get yourself on the map here. But it's not undoable. It's pretty much doable if you are consistent. And I used to have a goal at least my first year, apart from classes, that I need to talk to one person who is a Hastings alum, or who's a South Asian lawyer, not from Hastings, and who's doing the sort of work that I want to do. And that's just opened up my networking. And to answer your second part of the question, which is how to get a good job. So I wouldn't say there is one right answer. It just depends on the type of people you meet. Always have good grades. People do check grades. So make sure you're academically really good, not just in the US, but also in India. Make sure you enjoy law school, but at the same time, definitely focus on your grades. Make sure you have good standings. I was a first class student, which is like about 60% in with ILS, and I'm a good academic standing student here. So that's just one of the baseline requirements. Have a good academic standing and a good grade system. And then it just, secondly, and um, kind of involved with the third aspect, is just meet a lot of people, make sure you have a good network, apply to tons of jobs, either on campus through your own, but just make sure you reach out to the right sort of people. If um, and frame your emails when you're reaching out to people in a way that you're asking and not really demanding jobs, because it depends on the tone and the posture in which you reach out to people. So it comes with experience. It also comes with meeting a lot of people, your peers, your colleagues, and also people who from outside. So I wouldn't say it's one right answer. It's a mixture of everything. So yeah.
Tell us something. 8 years of studies, 5 years of your
Yeah.
BLLB honors, and 3 years of JD. Isn't it taxing to study for so long? Isn't it really demanding and challenging to be studying for 8 years at a stretch?
Yes, it is. It actually is definitely challenging and taxing, but I have some. Personally, I'm someone who's always been inclined in academics and who's um, always wanted to study further. And when I decided the choice between JD and LLM, it was just with again a lot of support from my parents because um, uh, I knew I would be investing a lot of time, money, and energy into doing a 3 year program after having done 5 years. So it was just make sure you have a lot of support back home amongst your friends who are supportive of doing this. And yes, it is taxing, but at the same time, it's really rewarding if in the end, once you meet so many people, you end up with good grades and you have a good work experience to show for. I feel education has always been an investment, and that is how it's been taken in my family. So since I come from such a background, it didn't seem that taxing. Although there are some of the days when I'm like, oh my God, why am I not done yet? But I've always, uh, my parents have always instilled in me that education is an investment and it would come in handy one day or the other. And now and having gone through the JD route and trying to understand how US system works is easier than just reading about things online. As opposed to having experienced it with talking to professors and actually learning the classes, it's a lot of and in class systems in the US are also different. So you have a lot of discussion and it's not more of a lecture. So the Socratic method has actually taught me, and I'm learning so much, not just from my professors, but from my classmates and through their experience of through undergrad and all the legal issues that they faced then. And they're realizing there were issues now. So it's just, I would say it's a rewarding experience. Yes, it can be taxing, but make sure you're mentally prepared. You have a lot of support back home amongst your friends. And I've been fortunate enough to have both of those things. And I know my friends back home in India and here are really supportive of whatever I'm doing. And so, yeah, so it can be taxing, but it depends on if the perspective that you go forward with.
All right, I have the last question for you today, and this is a question by Anubhav Pandey who wants to know who should not go for transactional corporate law classes.
Um, who should not go for it? That's actually a really interesting question. So transactional lawyers are, I would say, most heavily writers and readers. So you spend a lot of time writing, honing contracts, and if you cannot spend a lot of time talking one-on-one to people who not the law background people who are engineers, who are businessmen, who are stock exchange analysts. And if you need to know your response group and you need to be able to talk to someone who's not a lawyer and try to explain to them what the problem is with what they're planning to do. So it's explaining to a layman almost. It's spending a lot of time writing, reading, and honing your agreements and drafting. So you need to be someone who is comfortable with pen and paper, who's comfortable with spending long hours editing documents, who's comfortable just making sure who's given a rough draft and then they make who's almost or given a skeleton and they make a whole document out of it. So it's a lot of writing based transactional skills, but it's also speaking. Many people think that transactional lawyers don't speak, but they do. They speak with their clients. They speak with the in in-house. They speak with the top level executives, and they try to explain the legal aspects. So it's pretty much a mixture of both. Even though you don't go to court and argue, you do try to negotiate transactions and try to explain the legal aspects and issues to the executives and the other business professionals. So yeah, it's pretty much a mixture of all these things. So if you don't like doing that, then this is probably not for you.
All right, that was Swetha Gopalakrishnan for you, ladies and gentlemen. Swetha, thank you so much for joining us today on An Hour with LawSikho. It was an absolute pleasure and very enlightening to have you with us. We hope to have you again sometime soon, talking about some other issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really enjoyed this.
Same here. For all of you who's watching us right now, we'll be coming back again at 8 o'clock with Abhyuday Agarwal, who will be telling you things about company law you never knew before or you probably want to know. And whether or not, if you're studying in a law school and you've not studied company law yet, you have to and you must attend this session. For everybody who's watching us, thank you so much for joining us today on this exclusive episode of An Hour with LawSikho. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Hit the bell icon because we are going live every now and then talking about various issues related to law, which will definitely help you. Coming back again, back at 8 o'clock in the evening. I'll see you soon after an hour. Thank you so much, and till then, our LawSikho.